Welcome back to the Diet Doctor Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Scher. Today, we're going to do another compilation episode, but this one specifically focusing on an experiment run by Dr. Nick Norwitz and some of his colleagues, some of his medical school colleagues at Harvard Medical School, an experiment where they all wore CGMs and kind of saw what they saw, right? Experiencing everything they did, from the way they slept and their stress and, of course, their nutrition and what that did to their blood sugar and their CGMs, and tied it into a class and further discussion and exploration of the other aspects of metabolic health. Now, on the one hand, it's a really cool experiment brought on by self-motivated medical students who really are learning a lot about how to use CGMs, how to talk to their patients about it, and what they can mean, but not without some controversy, which we get into in this episode as well. Controversy about appropriate versus inappropriate use of CGMs, and what constitutes healthy versus unhealthy responses, and if that was really characterized well enough in this study, and if it's being communicated well enough to the public. So we're going to have interviews with Nick Norwitz, with Mark Czeisler, and with Dr. Mealnie Hoenig, who is the attending. So let's get into them one by one, see what they had to say, what their experience was, and what their take-homes were. First, we're going to hear from the paper's main author, Dr. Nick Norwitz, who's also basically the originator of the idea. And so he has a PhD already and is now in medical school at Harvard. And he's not your average medical student, though. He's already got a number of publications, and he's involved in so many different areas focusing on metabolic health. So much of his efforts is on metabolic health and sort of changing the way that metabolic health is taught and thought of. And him being a medical student, he's sort of trying to change it from the inside. And that's one of the great things I love about this story, how this was really just him and his fellow students just having discussions about metabolic health. And that's where this whole study idea came from. So let's hear from Dr. Nick Norwitz and what he thought about the study, why he wanted to do it, what his lessons were, and what he thinks about some of the controversy. Well, Nick, welcome back to the Diet Doctor Podcast. It's great to have you again.
Thanks for having me, Brett. Excited to be here.
I think it's awesome that you're back again talking about metabolic health, because the first time you were on our podcast, you were on this compilation episode talking about metabolic health. And now here you are back with more metabolic health nuggets and news to give us. So this time with a new study and, of course, brand new controversy that surrounds many studies and publications. The short, I guess, intro is that you did an experiment with some colleagues with medical students at Harvard where they experienced CGMs, and you put it in the context of metabolic health and how CGMs and blood sugar can relate to metabolic health. So that's like the really basic outline. But what I want to get to is, what was your motivation in starting this? What were you hoping to achieve? And then we'll talk about some more of the details and what you actually learned from it.
So to take a 50,000-foot view, when I came into medical school, given my personal experience and my research experience, I had built a real passion for metabolic health, as you know. I think it's focusing on metabolism, lifestyle, nutrition. I'm not even going to get on my soapbox about why metabolic health is important. You've probably heard that from other people. But my self-proclaimed goal was to kind of try to plant a seed for, this is interesting and something we should be talking about a little bit more amongst my peers. I didn't want to be a pusher, but I just kind of wanted to, where, the opportunities arose, plant seeds. Like, what about this study to, look at things in a little bit of a different way with respect to this disease, X, Y, Z. And what ended up happening over the course of time, and I don't actually completely attribute this to me planting seeds as much as some might have already been planted. As we were progressing through our curriculum, there was will amongst the students to kind of look in a lot more to diet and nutrition than is naturally incorporated into the curriculum. So over the course of time, there was just a gravity drawing a group of students together who had this common interest.
Yeah.
There was kind of an inflection point where after one class, a student proposed that we had a discussion around metabolic health. Asked if I would get up and just say a few things. I talked, people stayed after class, and we just really got excited about this concept of doing something. We hadn't defined what around metabolic health. And we percolated on it for a while because, the curriculum's not going to change like that. It's very well structured, very dense, and it's, difficult to reorganize. I just gave a little presentation, and the analogy I was using is kind of like, I don't know if you ever played that little board game rush hour with the little cars. You have to like, okay,
No, no, that
well,
one. Sorry.
another analogy would be like Tetris. Like it's hard to squeeze things in and move things
Yes.
around. So I wasn't in the position to, incorporate nutrition into the curriculum very easily.
Wait, let me pause you there for a second. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've talked to so many doctors, but mostly older doctors, and they say, "Yeah, we got no nutrition training. We got maybe an hour." Has any of that changed? Or I guess we should start with an update. Like, what's new in nutrition training at Harvard Medical School? Or is it still pretty poor in terms of the time and quality?
It's poor. There are
Yeah.
systematic reviews on medical educations around the world, and people say it's poor. Doctors say it's poor. Medical students say it's poor. We had like one optional session where we got a MyPlate handout. That's
Yeah.
kind of the quality. There is will, I think, among the faculty and more broadly. There was with the McGovern Commission in May, basically calling for adding nutrition to medical education.
Yeah.
So there's a will amongst the faculty. People want to incorporate it. It's just logistically difficult. And obviously, I can't redesign the curriculum. I can give feedbacks on little bits of points, but I was thinking, what can I do? And so the idea came is like, well, there's the opportunity to get creative here. We have to engage with nutrition every single day, or almost every day if you fast, I guess, by virtue of being human. And so why not give students a tool to kind of motivate them to think more about nutrition and immerse in it in kind of like a hands-on metabolic immersion lab type experience.
Yeah.
And so I kind of floated the idea. I'm like, I've played with CGMs before. They're pretty cool. What do you guys think about me getting some CGMs? People got really excited about it. I talked to the faculty. We went through all the right routes, and just with a little bit of legwork, we went through the IRB and all the necessary processes. Got approval, got support from the school, and we had just some great supports outside. I got the CGMs via Dexcom through Rob Sives, who served, you obviously know Rob, and he served as our clinician for the project. So he did all the health and safety screenings. People could check in with him. And then we just got it running. The protocol originally was, and it was always intended to be multimodal. I can go through the trainings and stuff in a bit. I think that'll kind of pop up more when we talk about controversies. But the CGM was like a catalyst to engage with metabolism. So we were having journal clubs where we were discussing, primary literature that was interesting to students. People were dietary tracking, sleep logging, and it just became a great community experience. Some of the most consistent feedback we got at the end is how fun it was to kind of nucleate around this. That, to do it on your own would have been kind of isolating. To do it together was really cool. I kind of think of the analogy of, the Dr. Seuss book with Starbelly Sneetches. Like, the CGMs were on, people were walking around, like, check out my CGM and look at all the metrics. It was cool. And then enthusiasm really started to build because it's something that's pretty visible in class. So when people are talking about it, another group of students will be like, well, what's that? What are you doing? And so we started getting more and more requests. And we tried to I was limited in how many CGMs I and my team could acquire and disseminate, but we ended up distributing to as much as 40 students. And then getting some data, qualitative and quantitative, in terms of feedback, and it was overwhelmingly positive. And so that's where we are now. Students just had a good time with it. They were attesting that it improved their understanding of their own metabolic health, their enthusiasm for metabolic health, and the relevance they see with respect to medicine. They said it would help them better serve their patients. In fact, we were building, I would think, patient advocates in real time. We had people in clinic with their own CGMs, then helping patients acquire CGMs, including type 2, which is really cool. And so, people got enthusiastic about it. Some changed their lifestyle, some didn't.
So CGMs were the main tool, but it sounds like they were part of the program and not the entire program, if that's an accurate statement, because you talked about lectures and discussions and other things. So CGMs tell you about blood sugar. What else did you include in the educational part of this study?
The screening labs kind of doubled for fodder for students to engage in metabolic health. So, we had done a lot of the basic science and metabolism curriculum, interpreting labs and stuff, and we got an extremely comprehensive set of labs. Rob ordered that, and he talked with the students about it, so that you could take that along with the CGM data, and for those who wanted, share data, talk about how to interpret your own labs, because we were already doing this as exercises, in pathology as part of our curriculum. But now you have your own lab to look at. So what am this triglyceride mean, my thyroid mean? And some students, and we knew this would probably happen, were identifying areas of their health that could be improved, or identifying underlying diseases that they didn't know they had. So one person had Hashimoto's, and it's funny because he actually just got the diagnosis via the antibodies right before we had our thyroid session, and we were doing ultrasounds on each other, and you could see it also on the ultrasound. So he was going to find out anyway. But common things you'd expect, like 9 out of 13 in the original core cohort were vitamin D insufficient. 4 were vitamin D deficient. And they just started supplementing with vitamin D spontaneously. Some of them reported feeling a lot better. We have some students that are from abroad or from near the equator, and now they're up in Boston. So it's not really surprising there is vitamin D deficiency, but then we can talk about that. So in terms of the education, the trainings included education around how to interpret glycemic responses in different contexts. So the effects of exercise, cortisol awakening response, carbohydrates, things like that. And then a lot of it was really student interest driven during the weekly meetings. So what we do is I would send out a bunch of paper topics to vote on, and students could also submit topics for the vote. And we'd say, like, there are these new papers in Cell. Which one is most interesting to you? Then we send it out, we all read it, and then we go discuss it. So an example was there was the Zevi et al. Piece 2015 in Cell about personalized glycemic responses and using CGMs to personalize diets for patients. And kind of we dug through the literature of that. That is actually the same team that just published the artificial sweeteners piece. It's also on Twitter. Yeah, they're phenomenal. The Weitzman Institute.
So I guess the point, or one of the points of my question though, is like blood sugar does not equal all of metabolic health. So it doesn't measure insulin, it doesn't measure triglycerides and HDL and waist to height ratio, and so but you did all that as part of the baseline and sort of baked it into the discussion about metabolic health, and CGMs were sort of the catalyst. Is that an accurate statement?
That's accurate. And what I would say is, the criticism could arise, and has arisen, that CGMs don't give you a picture of metabolic health comprehensively. And I agree with that 100%. But at the same time, in terms of accessible continuous monitoring metrics, that's what we got at the time being. If we have a continuous cholesterol meter, then we'll use that in time. And we're talking about expansions using other health wearables like Oura rings. It's actually very ironic, if you don't mind going on a tiny tangent just for a sec. 2 days after we published our paper, a paper came out in Nature Biomedical Engineering about a continuous multi-metabolite monitor, which I thought was way far away. But they've designed this continuous multi-metabolite monitor now that can detect various metabolites in sweat, calibrates to sodium and body temperature, things like cholesterol, all 9 basic essential amino acids. It's coming up, but right now, I didn't have that technology, so we have CGMs. It's what I could supply as a lowly medical student who has access to some things, and then you discuss with your peers, and the limitations of the technology doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. It just means it's limited technology.
So did you give any goals about where people wanted their blood sugar to be? Or is it more just like, here, go forth and see what you learn from it without prescribing specific goals of keeping your blood sugar in a certain range?
Yeah, there were no prescriptions by any means. I think students, I didn't know how people would react. And I was actually really surprised to find that people started to establish their own goals based on how they were feeling. So students would report that I just feel better when my blood sugar is stable between 70 and 90. I feel better athletically. I feel better mentally. And in self-reflecting, as I'm sure you've seen people do, on how they feel at different levels. So what another student was like, when I was feeling lethargic, I thought I was having hypo, because people are just like, I'm hypoglycemic. It's just part of the parlance. And then they would eat. And they realized, no, that's actually not the case at all. I'm not hypoglycemic when I'm tired, and I don't then need to compensate by eating. And so if you check out the paper in table 1, there's a ton of really cool quotes by students just reflecting on their experience. And I think another positive aspect is that it knock-on positive experiences on health behaviors. So not only some people changing their diet, but then they were sleeping better and exercising more consistently. just because they were then committed to their metabolism broadly, because that's kind of what we were discussing.
Yeah, so I guess one pushback, I was going to say potential pushback, no, it's a clear pushback, is that the goal for health, for metabolic health, doesn't have to be a flat CGM line, that there are natural blood sugar variations that can be completely consistent with a healthy lifestyle. And we don't want to sort of encourage that you should eat and live in a way where your blood sugars never increase. So let me just ask you first, do you think that's a valid concern when giving people CGMs, that they might interpret it in that way?
Broadly speaking, with the lay public, yes.
Okay. Now, did you do something with your cohort to help them understand that, especially considering the population, that they're medical students, not the general population?
Yeah, that was included in the training, where we talked about, I think I mentioned earlier, like, other things affect blood sugar, cortisol awakening response, stress, how you slept the night before, and there are normal glycemic variations that probably are healthy if you're eating, if you have a healthy young athlete like we do, and they have a banana before a workout and their blood sugar bumps a little bit, that's fine.
Yeah.
And we were, constantly telling people that, like, I was reinforcing the point consistently, even though I think they knew. I mean, bear in mind, these are smart cookies. Like, we have like a Rhodes Scholar who's doing 2 PhDs and an MD kind of deal. They're not your average Joe kind of person. And I don't think it really, people tended to, over the, whole study, there was a slight reduction in carbohydrate intake, but it was mostly, it wasn't like I'm going to avoid broccoli. It was like we have a vegan participant. He's still vegan at the end of the study. He's just like, I actually find I do better eating fewer tropical fruits and maybe more berries. It's like that. There's one person in the study who was low carb, not me. I wasn't a participant. For clarity, I actually wasn't myself a participant. I recused myself. But then there were 3 vegetarians and a vegan, and they were still vegetarian and vegan at the end of the study. They just had a little bit of insight, and it was. There's a lot of nuance to how behaviors impact your glycemic variability, not just in a point in time, but over time. And we discussed that too. So people were noticing when I slept poorly or I was stressed, that just made me more reactive, for example. Right. Or when we were talking about the Zevi paper, where we're kind of breaking down the figures and it's like, look here, if you have more fiber, in the short term, that actually increases glycemic variability. In the long term, it decreases it. Kind of think on those scales.
Right. So if someone had like a plate of lentils and some berries and some root veggies, and their blood sugar goes up to 130 and then comes right back down within like 45 minutes, there are a couple ways to interpret that. One could be, oh my God, my blood sugar went from 80 to 130. That's a variability of 50. That's concerning. The other way to interpret it would be like, oh, look, it came right back down within 45 minutes. It's a totally normal response. I can keep eating those foods and not be a concern. Was that level of detail sort of, educated among the group? I guess my point would be that I feel the second interpretation is probably the more accurate interpretation, even though they both are accurate, but I think the second is maybe the more helpful, I guess.
You're saying if it has a spike and it comes down quickly, that's indicative of a healthy response?
Yeah, like one is 130 truly a spike, and then if it comes down within 45 minutes, it's still a sign that you have good metabolic health, and you're not on the road to insulin resistance.
It's effectively what you just described is effectively what an oral glucose tolerance test is, and we all know what oral glucose tolerance tests are. I would obviously say you have to take it in the context. Is it a healthy metabolic? Is it healthy to have a giant slice of cake and go up to 150 and come down quickly? Well, like maybe it's a challenge and your response is healthy. It doesn't mean it's a healthy behavior. So there's some just logic built in there. But I think it just made people more conscious of the decisions they made. And that's what people were saying. I'm more cognizant, more aware. And that doesn't mean if there's free food, medical students aren't going to take it. Providing CGMs was not going to overpower the influence of free food, let me tell you. It just I think gives people information. And one thing that we discussed, because I have my peers involved in the design of the questionnaires, and concerns going in is, food is integrated with culture, and people were worried, like, I feel like having a CGM might make me enjoy food less because they'll be focusing on it all the time. So that was included in the follow up, where people could kind of comment on, were you affected negatively in that way?
Yeah.
Nobody reported that, even the people that had raised that as a potential concern, which actually to me was somewhat surprising. I thought somebody might, and now it was a small group and it was self selected. So that doesn't mean that's not a possibility. You have to know
Right.
yourself and whether or not it'll be a good tool for you. But we
Right.
didn't see that at this point in time.
Yeah. And what was the response from some of the attendings that you worked with? Because they've been around for a while. They should probably know about CGMs and the experience of CGMs. Were they also sort of surprised and maybe a little educated by this whole process?
I think they were really excited to see students excited
Yeah.
and engaging in something that was student motivated. I think that's just the way my professors are. I had built a relationship with a few who opened up to me about their own experiences or family members' experiences with low carb or curing their cat with a ketogenic diet kind of thing. So I think it's on a lot of their radar, surprisingly. And I think they were excited to have students engaging with it and thinking about it. Um, but yeah, we weren't per se going in depth with our CGM data to professors one on one. So I don't think they were necessarily surprised by the findings. I did talk with a few broadly about the stuff in the supplement we ended up publishing, like the C peptide levels across the group, the glucagon levels, which are all just kind of interesting with
Yeah.
respect to what reference ranges are. So, like, the majority of the group, I think it was the majority or a large minority, had C peptides that were below the reference range. They were below normal, which is like,
Mhm.
that's interesting when interpreting it with it, like, because when we're going into clinic, when we're seeing a C peptide, that's going to get flagged as abnormal, you know? Or
Right.
one really interesting thing, this was actually interesting to our endo professors and our group at large. I think the biggest downside of the CGMs for a quarter of the students um, was the alarm, because
Yeah.
no, the CGM alarm you can turn off until 55, and during the night, a lot of people, these are normal, healthy people, were going below 55. And in lecture, we're like taught, if you're below 55, that is a problem. Like, if
Sure.
and there's not a lot of studies with CGMs in healthy young people. So
Right.
what we were seeing is actually a lot of us were dipping below 55 quite normally, and even into the 40s.
Yeah.
Which, is that a normal response? That's just kind of curious. That was an interesting thing. So
That's interesting. Right. If you're, well, were those people in ketosis who were in the 40s?
no,
No, not necessarily.
there was
Okay.
nobody was on a ketogenic diet. One person was low carb, but not
Yeah.
ketogenic. So no,
That is interesting. That's
no,
low.
it is low, but everybody.
Yeah.
So anyway, small sample size, but just interesting fodder for thought.
Yeah. So what about your impression on some of the Twitter controversy? Twitter is Twitter. People maybe say things in Twitter that they wouldn't say in person and maybe don't have all the information and all the space to air their full opinion. But were you surprised by that?
Initially, yes. In retrospect, no. I think my impression was there were a couple years ago, there was a big blow up on Twitter around CGMs for the lay public, and that
Mhm.
predates my involvement on Twitter. So I think the pump was primed.
Yeah.
And then this got conflated with just general opinions around whether or not healthy people should have CGMs. Whereas really what we were doing is applying CGMs for medical education. I think, like I said to you before we recorded, I'm not advocating for me taking a basket of CGMs and walking around Boston throwing them out like candy. Neither, and that's not what I did. I think it requires, somewhat targeted use, but I think medical education is a potential use case if you train young future doctors well. And I think there are a lot of upsides with really next to no downsides. We talked about a few of the upsides just with engagement, but as I mentioned before, patient advocacy.
Yeah.
And, a lot of physicians now that we're working under don't know that much about this technology. And so, like, for example, we had one patient, this was in the first week of the study, and she came in and she was all excited because she's like, Nick, I was in clinic and this patient with type 1 came in. And he saw my CGM and started to ask about it. Turns out he was very nervous about getting a CGM. He didn't know what it was. He thought it would hurt, XYZ. She was showing it to him, and then he got really excited. And then with the attending, they actually ended up getting him one. So now that patient won a CGM who otherwise would not have been. Now, I don't know what his outcome was, but presumably it's going to help him.
That's the coolest part, I think, about this, because I know personally, before I started prescribing CGMs to people with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, I used it on myself first, because then I could explain it a lot better and understand it a lot better. Whereas I never had that chance in medical school. And, I guess maybe I predated CGMs to a degree, but at least the common use of them. But having that opportunity just helps you understand it better. You could read in a book what it's about, but to actually have firsthand experience helps you explain it to the patient. And that is the perfect example right there, that the patient was nervous about it, but she was able to give him a much more detailed answer and explanation than if she wouldn't have used that CGM, presumably. So I think that's awesome. That's such a great outcome there.
And one other benefit, I think, was, I'm calling it now, becoming metabolically woke. Like when you're engaging with this, all the time, and you're walking around the food environments that we have in hospitals, the things that are, unambiguously dysfunctional. Like I've seen a patient, I've said this before, but with diabetes, fasting blood sugar 217, being given chocolate cake and mashed potatoes for lunch.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is not serving this patient. And if you point that out to someone, like I pointed out to the attendant, they're like, you know what, you're right. But it's just not something we tend to shine the spotlight on.
Right.
And when you have a bunch of students with CGMs walking around, or maybe if we do an expansion, attendings and residents, it's actually a way to maybe start to shift the culture a little bit, which we need to do without being pushy and tisk-tisky. But like when you're wearing a CGM and you're walking around and you go to the cafeteria and it's like, you know what? There's like limited amounts of just hard-boiled eggs, but like 30 different types of Danish. And that's kind of like the option we have. And then maybe like on occasion, a mozzarella stick. So, in terms of low carb, like the food is awful.
Yeah.
You go for breakfast, and it's like DiGiorno's pizza.
This doctor's lounge is just full of chips and it's full of donuts, and it's absurd. And, it's interesting because if you asked the doctors, do you think this is good for you? They would say no. But they don't, but it's like, what I see is that thought process just doesn't happen. It's just on automatic. But like you're saying, with that CGM and knowing what you're going to see on your CGM, it's that behavioral reinforcement. And that's what I think is so cool. Like in the beginning, most people who start with a CGM learn how different foods affect them. But then once you sort of learn that, then it becomes more of the behavioral modification, like the accountability partner almost, to make you take that extra thought. And I think that's what really strikes me as another great example of how this works for people, especially like you're saying, when the food in the hospital is terrible. And for medical students and residents who don't necessarily have time to make a meal, home cooked meal, right? You're grabbing whatever you can as you're running down the hallway, basically. So it does help people wake up to what's going on. So I think it's a fantastic intervention, and you should be applauded for what you did. And it seems like you did it in the right way too, not here's your CGM, here's your blood sugar, this is what metabolic health is all about. But this is a part of a bigger discussion on metabolic health. And I think that you should definitely be commended for making it part of that integrative teaching module, for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, no, the faculty and the students made it really easy. There was just the will to have it done. So filled out some forms basically and did some organizing, sent some emails, and here we are. So it's exciting. And I think there's a lot of will to move forward. We've been approached by a couple CGM companies and now in talks with hopefully some residents at MGH. I would love to do what I call 3-dimensional expansion, which is horizontal expansion, other medical schools who are interested, depth of expansion, because you can do other wearables. We have a few, like an Oura ring. So what other tools can we integrate with the CGM to give a more holistic picture of health? And then the vertical expansion, I think it'd be super cool to do, in our clerkships, the clerkship medical students, the residents at different levels, and the attendings. Because for a few reasons. One, I think all levels could benefit just in terms of education, but then the community aspect. We found it was really community building for the students, and to kind of tie different levels of medical training together via that community aspect, I think could be really cool.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I was going to ask you what was in the future and what the next steps were, and that sounds really interesting. And something like the Aura Ring, I think, is also really cool because people's patients are going to be using them, whether you think they're important or helpful or not. People are going to be using them. So to have that experience, to be able to give them the feedback, like, where's the heart rate variability good, or where is it maybe a little weak? What does the readiness score really mean? What is it? How does it relate to your sleep and your steps and all? Like to actually have that experience and know it and be able to give that feedback to the patient, I think is really cool. Otherwise, they're going to get it online from who knows what kind of resource. So it really helps you sort of keep the teaching and make it that much deeper. So I think that would be interesting, and to expand it to residents and to attending. So it sounds like there are big plans for this being just the first of many. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll be around for a while. So I thought, have some fun. We'll see how the conversation evolves. Just more broadly, it's been extremely positive, I've found, within academia, at least in my circles. And that's in juxtaposition to, as you were mentioning before, how the conversation evolves in Twitter. I find that in general. I mean, I know you're an academic as well. It's very interesting. I don't know if you agree, to see the distinction between conversations around a particular topic when you're talking, face to face with someone who's an academic. You turn over to social media, and yeah, I don't really fathom why this is such a fiery topic.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head that the pump was primed with the prior discussion about CGMs in the general healthy public, and the reaction was, oh, this is just one more of those to promote a low carb diet and a flat glucose curve and CGMs in healthy people, where we have no evidence saying that this is benefits outcomes, which is all true, except that it doesn't really apply to the situation, because this situation was much broader and deeper and more involved. And if you just react to the initial information, I can understand why that happened. But hopefully through discussions like this, people are going to understand, oh, wait, this was much deeper than just glucose and CGM, and it truly was about metabolic health. And it truly was, there were so many other positive experiences. And as long as people know, as long as we're talking about the downsides to CGMs, how everybody should not be using them, and if they are, how they have to know it's not just a flat line that you're looking for, and there are natural variabilities that are full within a healthy lifestyle. As long as we're talking about that, then that's okay. It's the sort of the inappropriate use where that's not talked about. But I think you did that perfectly well, the way you explained it and the way you described it in your paper. So I think the medical students are better off for it. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks a lot for taking the time to join me. And I look for even more. I mean, you clearly show the will, the desire, and the creativity to sort of forge new grounds and get new things out there. So I'm excited. I know there'll be more coming from you down the line. So yeah, we'll have you back.
For sure. Thanks so much.
Next, we're going to hear from Mark Czeisler, Dr. Mark Czeisler. So he's a medical school classmate of Nick Norwitz, but he also has a PhD in psychology from Australia. And he was a participant in this study. So we get to hear his experience firsthand as a medical student, what he thought of metabolic health before the study, how the study sort of changed his thought on it, and how it helped frame his thoughts on CGM and wearables and sort of his experience. So let's hear from Mark. Dr. Mark Czeisler, thanks so much for joining us today on the Diet Doctor podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so we just heard from Nick Norwitz and heard about the study that you participated in. About using the CGMs, learning about metabolic health. So I want to start actually before the study, though, and kind of get an understanding of you as a medical student. So you've got your PhD in psychology, and now you're your second year medical student. What was your general understanding of metabolic health, and how was it sort of being taught to you as a medical student?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, at some level, everyone is exposed to metabolic health just by living and eating. And I would say that a lot of my, prior conceptions and beliefs about metabolic health were kind of, at least personally, based on like a calorie in, calorie out kind of perspective. I thought in general, there are some types of foods that are better than other types of foods, but not really having a mechanistic understanding of the physiology behind that. And then in terms of its integration into the curriculum, there is a longitudinal nutritional theme, which is a new thing as of a year at Harvard Medical School. And I think, they're still ironing out how that actually looks and where it can really fit into case-based learning. And I think that as Nick has talked about, we're definitely opportunities to incorporate it a lot more, I think, into the curriculum, and a desire for students to recognize that. I think a lot of students in training are trying to understand what kind of strategies there are to optimize health, before in a preventative manner, and then also in interventional ways. When someone is in the hospital, really thinking about the entire experience, rather than treating like a specific condition acutely.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to sum it up. We focus so much on here's the pathophysiology, here's this disorder, how do you treat it, and focus a lot less on, well, could we have prevented this from ever happening in the first place? So I think that's a great point. Now, Nick, one of the things that I really liked about the way Nick described it was this sort of seems like it was born just out of a discussion among, medical students talking about metabolic health, and then just all sort of came up with the idea together, and Nick sort of spearheaded it. But I love it. It's the camaraderie and the we want to learn, we want to do this for ourselves, and that really sort of take the initiative to do this. So since you've gone through it now, and we talked about the study design and all that already, but since you've gone through it, what has changed in terms of your perception of metabolic health? And I want to hear both from the perspective of the CGMs and from sort of the ancillary discussions and educational materials that you had during this process.
Those are great questions. I think, and to your point, I just want to comment and talk about how inspiring it is to go to school, and what a privilege it is to engage in these kinds of discussions where after class we're excitedly talking about the material and trying to think of how can we learn now what does exist, and kind of think about ways that it might be able to be improved in kind of the longer term. That's just a preemptive comment there. But in terms of my experience wearing this CGM, I think it was very enlightening to think about a way to measure some level of the influence of what we're eating on our bodies in near real time, in a way that kind of the closest thing that I might have been able to do before that was something like calorie counting, or kind of over the course of trying out a specific meal timing approach or different foods. You're looking at bodily changes, which takes a longer interval of time, and there are a lot of other factors that influence that as well. So I think for me, what was really exciting was being able to think about, first of all, how much I learned just by being able to have real-time biofeedback monitor, and how fun it was to check in and think about, oh, well, what did I eat, and this is what happened, and then thinking about that, being a little bit more conscious in the future, and then also from the perspective of someone who might be wearing a CGM for medical purposes, to be monitoring their blood sugar levels as someone who has diabetes, maybe really thinking about how much of a consideration that is all the time to be wearing that, and then even factors that were not really related to the metabolic health component necessarily, but just the social element of having so many people ask me when I'm playing basketball, why are you wearing that thing on your arm? And so that learning that perspective, and then thinking about what it's like to respond to that question, and how do you approach it? I think in discussions with other classmates who participated as well, is something that we're going to be carrying into our careers as we get along further in training.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's going to make you a better doctor and be able to, empathize more with somebody who's wearing a CGM and has type 2 diabetes, and counsel them better on how to use it? Like, has it really made that kind of impact?
I really do believe so. I'm optimistic, especially because within a couple of weeks, I think for the most part, a lot of students felt as though they had some level of understanding of the process. And so it's not like it's going to take learning it for years and years to really understand that element of the experience. And so then I think it also humanizes it a little bit, where you know that you have kind of your target range of glucose and where you want to be at a certain time, just for your own goals. And then sometimes life gets in the way, and I think that recognition as well is something that I'm grateful to have had, and I do think both for myself and for all students who are able to have this sort of experience, it is something that can really positively impact the way that we interface with patients and think about both in terms of the value of CGMs and other, the exciting thought is incorporating other elements of tracking both metabolic health and other types of health and kind of near to real time. And that way enabling and really empowering patients and even individuals who are in that preconditioned range, right? To really think about and have more information, be working with more information as they're making decisions about their health.
Yeah. It's interesting. You can read all you want about how, poor sleep and increased stress can raise your blood sugar and increase insulin resistance. So it's one thing to read it, and it's another thing to live it, because I'm sure medical students, from my memory, don't get a lot of sleep and don't exactly have a stress-free lifestyle. So I'm sure you and your colleagues really sort of saw that firsthand, how that can impact blood sugar. And it's so much more impactful to experience it firsthand than just to read it. But the drawback then is, and the concern that came across on Twitter and social media is certainly based in reality and based in truth, in that blood sugar does not equal metabolic health, and that's it. There's many other factors, and there is such a thing as normal glucose variation. Going up to 120 after eating a meal and coming down within a half an hour is not worse than a meal that keeps it right at 100 the whole time, especially in healthy people without prediabetes or diabetes. So I guess the question is, was that conveyed to you? And do you have that same understanding now, or has your understanding been shifted more towards blood sugar is the most important part of metabolic health and, sort of the end all be all? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think one thing that was really nice about the way that the study was, or that the experience was kind of described initially and then was throughout, was as really a learning experience in terms of the value of being able to monitor something in real time and really think about, how are these various elements of life impacting my own body? Mm-hmm. And one of the most interesting elements of that really was sitting with a group of friends and classmates and eating kind of similar meals and then having somewhat different responses across individuals. And then you start to think about, okay, well, these are the foods and these are the activities that for me make a difference, but that may not apply to everyone. And so having people really be able to discover that themselves, I think, is something that's really valuable, more so than kind of blanket guidance or whatever it is, which to an extent is required when there is limited access sometimes to CGMs or other strategies to monitor health indicators. In terms of the kind of single measure of metabolic health, I think in general in medical school and in this study, there has been an emphasis on kind of recognizing the bigger picture and not really narrowing in too much on a single indicator and recognizing the limitations. I think as long as we understand the purpose of why something is being measured or tracked and why a normal range, quote unquote, exists the way that it does, those data are powerful and can be informative without really, falling into the misguided notion that it's an end all be all measure. I think Body mass index is another example of that, where I think most individuals, and the curriculum has really emphasized that it is an important measure, but it is designed for one purpose, and it's not a single measure of metabolic health.
Yeah, great. It's a great analogy using body mass index, because again, for one measure and for the general population on a bell curve, okay, maybe it makes sense, but for that individual in front of you, you need so much more information. And I'd say the same for glucose. Glucose can be very helpful in many ways, but you want so much more information. The whole point of sort of this personalization concept, I think, is important, because you learn so much of what you learn in medical school is about guidelines and what do the guidelines say. And the guidelines are, again, based on that bell curve and made for like the general population. But it's so important to understand the individual variability. And yes, we may not have the capacity to treat every single person in the medical system with that individual precision. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't know about it. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't have experienced it. So hopefully the day will come where we can treat people in that way. I hope we can get there faster. So what do you see as sort of the next steps in terms of whether it's CGMs or other wearables, other personalizations, other personal experiences, medical students? Where do you see this want to go further to help your education and help you become a better physician to take better care of patients in the future?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think in terms of just responding to the first half of what you were saying about the potential of this, I think it reinforces the importance of thinking about clinical judgment and realizing that, the guidances exist, again, for a reason. But ultimately, in terms of the actual practice of medicine, you're working on an N of 1 basis. And so each individual, really considering the entire clinical picture and the patient as an individual and all that, becomes so much more important. And so then that kind of flexibility in terms of modifying treatment plans based on the specific needs of an individual is made possible by this level of monitoring. And I do think that in terms of where this goes in the future, I think that there are a couple of ways that we can think about it in terms of medical education. I don't know if Nick talked about, but already thinking about, and we talked about in the paper, kind of getting excited about additional monitors and what else can we measure? Sleep. I'm interested in sleep, so that's one for sure that would be exciting to try to think about sleep duration, sleep regularity, sleep quality, and then, which obviously, I mean, it's intricately linked with metabolic health as well. I think that there's an explosion of this kind of biometric feedback, these monitors that have me really excited, and hopefully with improving technology, there will be expanded access as well. And kind of, in the longer term, if not in the way that Nick kind of pioneered this with having it be an immersive kind of outside the curriculum endeavor, trying to incorporate it a little bit more so that, as for example, when we're learning about blood, we draw our blood on our classmates.
And that was always fun.
Right. And it's memorable, right? I mean, we remember that experience. And then whenever we're in class and we're talking about CBCs, we can think about that experience and we actually know to an extent what that is like. So, I would envision and hope for one day having a similar experience with something like glucose. So when we're talking about a patient's or a case where a patient has a glucose level of 55, recognizing that, that's low, but also some people dipped into 55 and when they were sleeping or whatever it is. And so kind of recognizing the different levels of, how things move as well.
Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Mealnie Hoenig. Now, Dr. Hoenig was the attending for this class where Nick and Mark and colleagues sort of dreamed up and executed this idea. So she was sort of the overseer and maybe kind of the spark to help encourage them along. Now, Dr. Hoenig is a nephrologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And she also said she's involved in a niche podcast called Channel Your Enthusiasm. And it's sort of like a nephrology physiology book club for anybody who's interested. But let's get Dr. Hoenig's perspective on this study and kind of what she learned from it as well. Well, Dr. Mealnie Hoenig, thanks so much for joining me today.
And thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So we've already heard from Nick and from Mark about their experiences with this study. Now, you sort of see it as their, I guess you could say, their advisor and their teacher and their mentor as an attending at Harvard Medical School, helping teach them. So first, I want to get just your overall impression of what you thought about this experiment and how it came to be and kind of what they went through.
Absolutely. When Nick approached me and asked about doing this study during my course, honestly, I was thrilled because that's really what we hope for. My course is called Homeostasis 2, which involves the kidney, the GI tract, and the endocrine system. So I think uniquely situated in the curriculum as an opportunity when students could learn about metabolism and how diet interacts with metabolism and the whole body. And so honestly, I was thrilled. We have a curriculum that is the flipped classroom. In other words, students are asked to prepare in advance so that we can have some exciting dialogue in person, do problem sets together, and work through complex issues. And so the idea that the students would be doing this at the same time that they're engaging in the curriculum was so exciting to me. I wish I thought of it. So,
okay. Well, let me ask you, if you had thought of it, would you have done anything differently?
The challenge, it's always hard. It's very exciting to do something small with students, and making it big is really the big challenge. And the way that our curriculum runs, we have 4 rooms with roughly 42 students. So this happened in one, I'll call it learning studio or learning suite. And so the majority of students in this learning suite were able to participate. But if in my dreams, we could offer it to everybody.
Right. Now, it seems like, hearing the feedback from the students who were in it, and of course, Nick, who helped organize it, it seems like it was almost universally positive in terms of people, it got them more engaged about metabolic health. It got them learning more about the intersection of nutrition and metabolic health. But there's some concern that if you boil it down to nutrition and glucose, that you're really not seeing the whole picture and maybe prioritizing too much small glucose changes and what they might mean. Do you think that's reasonable concern? And did you see that play out at all within this cohort?
Brett, that's a really good question. I think the issue is, these are first-year medical students who are just beginning to embark on what we hope will be a 4-year experience exploring how metabolism works, how a range of factors interfere with how or contribute to how the body handles energy. And so although it is a very small lesson, if you will, because we're talking about glucose, I think it's a very important place to start. And the hope would be that then they would build on that. And so capturing, starting small and having the students learn the excitement in this room, I wish you could have been there because it was so palpable. It was so bristling with energy, and students, showed each other the results on their app and how they were doing. And granted, made small observations that may or may not be true because, it's only one example at a moment, but it's still such a great place to start. And then the hope would be that if they do, if they find that interesting, if that whets their appetite, and I'm sorry for the pun, then perhaps then they'll engage in nutrition in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I love how you describe the excitement, just to see the excitement on your face when you're talking about it. Because as an educator, right, what's better than seeing the people you're educating being so self-motivated and excited about a project? I mean, that's what learning and exploring new things is all about. But let me ask you, did this maybe change anything that you felt about CGMs and the role they might play? Did it filter up towards you and impact your belief of it?
Well, I would share that not this year, but I'm a nephrologist, as I had mentioned. So a few years ago, in addition to, the classroom learning, we often have patients come tell their stories. And a colleague brought in a few patients who were wearing CGM to tell their stories. And at that point, I didn't even know that insurance companies would allow patients who did not have type 1 diabetes to participate with continuous glucose monitors. And that was practice changing for me, because then I could at least advocate for my patients on the meaning of these. And that has honestly been a game changer. So, so I would repeat that story in this class. And I really got a kick out of watching the students learning from their own tracings.
Yeah. Now, I think another sort of underlying theme through this, though, is that, and something that's come up a number of times in different podcasts I've done, is that the state of nutrition education within medical school is pretty bad. And that doesn't make it anybody's fault necessarily, but a statement of something that needs to be improved. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, one, if you would agree with that statement, and two, if you see a path to improving that level of education.
Okay, that's a tough one. I would say that one challenge, and since I'm an older faculty member, I could say, there's always that temptation that we say to trainees, well, when I was, in training, and it's really different, because I think that the burden on students and trainees is so great, because it's a fire hose of information. And so I think it's granted, I think I received no nutrition education myself. And I think that, of course, we can always be better, but the students are up against a lot, because there is so much to learn in nutrition and in elsewhere. And so I think having the lens that this is going to be the beginning of something is very important. So thinking about, engaging with my faculty, and if you're lucky enough to have colleagues or students who are on your team like Nick and Mark, to begin that journey, but thinking about it as a lifelong journey that doesn't all necessarily have to happen, for example, in the pre-clerkship phase, but could happen throughout medical school and throughout, learning.
Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective, that it's not you need to teach them everything. You've got them for a few years and teach them everything they need to know, as opposed to instill in them the curiosity to continue to learn and to sort of plant the seeds. And it sounds like this experiment did exactly that. It really did seem to sort of plant the seeds about metabolism, about nutrition, about metabolic health, and is going to, I just would imagine everybody involved in this experiment would now be even more motivated to learn more. So do you expect that to happen? Everybody in this whole cohort is just going to want to know more and get more curious and do more experiments, and this really is a kickoff to sort of bigger and better?
Well, I hope so. Of course, one flaw you could say of the study is that the students self-selected. So the students who engage in this might already be primed to want to learn more. But my hope would be, we do have a very nice course in the post-clerkship phase. It's an advanced integrated science course, and it's a very nice course run by Marie-France Yver and Chris Duggan. And it's a very popular course, and so my hope would be that many students would take that. We have a handful of other nutrition electives, but I think it would be appropriate for students to be asking hard questions in a range of electives. Nutrition doesn't have to be taught only in a nutrition class, right? It could be taught Well, in nephrology, when we think about processed foods and sodium intake and so on, it could be in an endocrine elective. It could be during your surgery clerkship when you're thinking about the use of enteral nutrition versus parenteral nutrition. And so I could envision it percolating through a curriculum and then beyond.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. You don't need to sit down and have a nutrition class, but when you're talking about wound healing or recovering from surgery, you talk about the importance of protein, or you talk, right, and you exactly like you mentioned, if you're talking about type 2 diabetes, how could you not talk about nutrition as well to factor into that? So yeah, to rather weave it throughout the curriculum rather than have just one dedicated class or something. I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, and I hope that this type of experiment, that people are going to see it, and medical students all over the world are going to see it and say, we can do that too, and we can learn. So, I mean, it's clear you're doing something right to inspire the intellectual curiosity in this group and allowing them the room to and the guidance to help them through this. So for that, I'm grateful, and I hope it is an example for everybody else. I mean, I guess that's a great way to wrap it up. Do you have any final things to add, or anything else you see for the future?
No, I would just add that it's really important always to listen to students who are going to ask hard questions, and maybe they will identify things we actually really don't know as well as we think we do. And so, this opportunity to work with these students was a highlight of my year for sure. So thank you for letting me say that.
That is wonderful to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Well, that wraps up this compilation study about this pretty cool and pretty unique experiment brought on by the group of students at Harvard Medical School using the CGM as well as other metabolic health education to learn about metabolism and nutrition. Now, we addressed some controversy, and I think we can agree that the controversy came from a good spot, right? From reasonable points, that it's not all about the flat line, and the use of CGMs in healthy people is not validated by medical data with outcome data. But that doesn't mean it should never be done. I think we can also say that there are other things we can learn from it, and this was sort of an organized medical education type atmosphere that they were using this, and how it's impacted them. I think it certainly seems like it was a net positive, but I don't want to discount the criticism, because again, I think it was well rooted, although maybe not as equally applicable to this situation as it is for other situations of using CGMs in the general public. So there's certainly going to be more to come from that. CGMs are very popular, being used quite a bit. And I think we're learning a lot about how to appropriately or maybe not appropriately use them. So to be continued, but thank you for joining us on the Diet Doctor podcast.